good enough, you see? And that's a very important discussion. Are you good enough to go to heaven? I think that could be a show topic, maybe another time, if not tonight. That's a lot of people wonder that. Am I good enough to go to heaven?
Well, it's I can't think of another question that would pique my interest. I mean,
Sure.
let's face it. I mean that
Right.
becomes everybody's. And not that none of us is really hoping to die anytime soon. Okay,
Right.
uh,
That's
but
true.
but the bottom line is, if and when the time does come,
Well,
you
except
know,
for maybe a few jihadists.
I remember I had a discussion with my sister. I told you she's born again, and she when she first told my father.
Well, she's not born again. She just found Christ.
Well, when she told my father for the first time, and this is many years ago, because he's been dead about 7 years now. Okay, and he said, "You can't tell me that my mother is not in heaven." Okay.
Mm.
Um, so I mean, it becomes very personal to a lot of people.
Oh, yes. Yes. Well, under what basis would she say that her mother was not in heaven? Was her mother
No, no,
not a
no, no.
believer? Was your mother
Well, no, my grandmother was not. She was Jewish. My sister is Jewish.
Jewish?
Well,
Okay.
my sister is Jewish, but she has accepted, Jesus as her savior, and
Hmm.
my father, took issue, you know, aside from telling
Sure.
her Tina that she was always the strange one in the family. Uh,
Mhm.
but you see, with my sister, she went through a couple of traumatic experiences at a very young age. She had two best
Mm.
friends. They were like triplets. She had two best friends. One died in a car accident just shy of her 16th birthday,
Uh,
and the other one threw an embolism in the shower and died at the age of 21. So
oh,
my
wow.
sister was never the same truly after that. In fact, she spent 6 months on a kibbutz in Israel. She was at kibbutz Masada, and she was, she always worked. She was floundering, looking for purpose, and I guess this gave her purpose, you know.
Mm. She's a lot like the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4. She was a looker. She was a seeker. Jesus came to her and asked her, "Give me a drink of water." And here's Jesus, a Jew, talking to a Samaritan woman. And if you know your history, your Jewish history, Jews do not have any dealings with Samaritans.
No, they don't.
So there's an actually fascinating story there in John chapter 4. If you read it, Jesus does something extremely interesting. He's not only just talking to her, but he's challenging her on this idea of using a physical analogy, which she's thinking, okay, why are you asking me for water? You don't have a tool. You don't have, a bucket. Why are you even talking to me as a Jew? And then Jesus kind of explodes with this idea of giving her a spiritual water that she'll never thirst again. And I believe that's what happened to your sister, Mark. I believe your sister got a taste of spiritual water. It was given to her. And like the Samaritan woman, she received it and never looked back, because the water that Jesus gives, this life-giving water, springs up in a soul that is a river of life-flowing water. So when somebody gets saved, their condition turns from always thirsting to always being satisfied. Okay? Most new believers, like your sister, become zealous, and they start witnessing to everybody they can, and that's probably when she got in the altercation with your dad. saying that her grandmother probably is not in heaven, but
No, no,
rather
no,
in
no,
hell.
no, no, no.
But
No, you misinterpreted. My father
I'm
was the
sorry.
one.
Go
My
ahead.
father was the one who said, like you say, if you're saved, you're going to heaven. Okay.
Right.
And she happened to just mention that. She never said my grandmother wasn't going to heaven, but my father was the one who picked up on it and said to her, "Well, you can't tell me that, my mother, grandma, is not in heaven right now." You know, and
Yeah.
he
Was
he
she a
took
good
he.
Jew?
Oh yeah, that
Yeah, she was.
generation. You're talking about uh, people who came over at this to America at the start of the 20th century. You know, uh, 19 the early 1900s. You know, and their roots were heavy in Europe, Russia. The pogroms, and they came to America for you know to make a life for themselves and for religious freedom.
Right. Yeah, they certainly have an interesting past. Well, but going back to your grandmother for just a minute, Felix, because I think this is, excuse me, Mark. So now I'm doing the opposite. I'm calling you Felix. What's going on, Mark, is that your grandmother probably followed the law to a T. She probably was, and I don't want to put words in her mouth at all. I didn't know your grandmother, but it sounds like she was a very dedicated Jew. Could
Oh,
I be right by assessing that?
well, when you're right, when you read about, you know, my grandfather went to synagogue every Saturday. And when he got older, he would go into his room and pray on his own. He knew all the prayers by rote. He didn't even have to look at his siddur, his Bible. He knew all the prayers. When it was Shabbos, Friday night, they kept the light burning, and my grandmother kept the gas oven on. She didn't light any. She didn't light the oven on Saturday. She started cooking and baking Friday. So
They probably
and
kept the Sabbath to a T.
yeah, I don't think she didn't go
Yeah.
to synagogue, but it wasn't always easy to go to synagogue. But the bottom line is that look, they did what they had to do. They had a candy store, and as much as they didn't like it, they did work on Saturday. They had to keep the place open. You know, but I mean,
Well, sure, but let's talk about this idea of work, okay? Because I think this answers a vital question. And anybody listening tonight who's wondering, am I good enough to go to heaven? I think this is your grandmother is a very good example. And this is unfortunately when Jesus said, "Your burdens are heavy." He's feeling bad for the people, the Jewish people. And here's the reason why. I'm going to give you a little bit of history that are found in some of the ancient rabbinic teachings. For instance, you could not walk more than 3,000 feet from your home on the Sabbath, and if you did, you would be breaking the Sabbath. Okay, and people would be afraid to be exiled out of the synagogue. They didn't want that, so
right,
they tried to keep the Sabbath and didn't want to break the Sabbath law. But some of these are pretty interesting. For instance, you were not allowed to look in a mirror because it would entice you to pull out gray hair, and if you pulled out gray hair on the Sabbath, you'd be breaking the Sabbath.
well,
I know these
that's
sound very strange, but these are real history.
well, that's one of the
Um,
things. Well, that's one of the things when you sit shiva, when somebody dies, you're supposed to cover the
uh-huh.
mirrors. Okay, you're not supposed to look in the mirrors. You're not supposed to shave. You're not supposed to bathe or
That's right.
make yourself
No,
look
you,
presentable.
you, yeah. But here's what Jesus did, and he clarifies the Sabbath. He says, "You're hypocrites," because he's not talking to the average person. He's not calling somebody like your grandmother, for instance. She's a victim in this. He's talking to the people who teach this baloney. He's saying you're hypocrites. But see, you're like whitewashed sepulchres, but inside you're full of dead man's bones. You're a clean, beautiful cup on the outside, but inside you're full of grime and nastiness. You're dirty. And the reason he said that is because if a donkey fell in a ditch, they would gladly take their donkey out on the Sabbath. And you're not supposed to do any work on the Sabbath.
That's
so
true.
They used the Sabbath. Number one, they misinterpreted what God meant to rest on the Sabbath. But they also had this idea that you would make up a bunch of laws and rules that were not originally given to them. I mean, for instance, you could not eat an egg that was laid, or you could eat an egg laid by a chicken on the Sabbath, but you have to kill the chicken after the Sabbath because the chicken laid the egg on the Sabbath. I mean, these just get more ridiculous. I actually talked to a Jewish person, actually right on your show, the Lisa girl, or I forgot her name, but she said that her neighbors and her parents or grandparents would not even touch the dials on the TV because if you turn the channel, you'd be working on the Sabbath.
Well, I don't know if you recall, but when we discussed the relevance of the Mosaic laws, okay, in today's society, in modern society, forgetting about the Ten Commandments, there were, 613 laws that Moses brought down from Mount Sinai. A lot of them...
Yeah, 634.
A lot of them, you'd be hard-pressed today. They have no bearing, in today's society.
Yeah, well, there was the element of not working on the Sabbath, but it was supposed to be a time of worship. You see, what happened eventually, Mark, is that the rabbinic teachings started teaching people that if you did anything on the Sabbath, you would break the law. There would be a lack of compassion on people. So that's why Jesus got mad. It wasn't that you shouldn't rest on the Sabbath. They did rest on the Sabbath. But their laws and rules were ridiculous. There were certain things that God didn't want them to do, but there were certain things they could do. In fact, he demonstrates this by healing a man on the Sabbath.
Right.
He said he asked the Pharisees a question. He healed the man and said, "Can I ask you a question? Is it good to do? Should we do good or is it good? Is it bad? Or should we do good or should we do evil on the Sabbath?" He's asking questions like that, telling them that, look, you're getting the Sabbath thing wrong. I am the Sabbath rest. God is the Sabbath rest. When Jesus came down in human flesh, he was God in flesh, telling the people, your rest is in me. That's when he said, your burdens are heavy. You are heavy laden. Come into me. Rest in me. Put my yoke upon you. And if you know about Jewish history, the yoke was the steering device on an oxen, right?
Right.
So he's saying, take my yoke, and put it upon you. And so that your burdens would be light.
Well, I'll give you a perfect...
See, God wants to take... Go ahead.
I was going to say, I'll give you a perfect example. My wife and my mother worked in the hospital, and one of the surgeons, in fact, the surgeon who operated on my grandmother, she had pancreatic cancer. He was an Orthodox Jew, a Shabbos observer. But if his phone rang, because of a medical emergency, he would answer it. Okay, and he felt nothing wrong with that because usually it was somebody's life at risk, But he was a Sabbath observer, and he would answer his work phone because he knew that if somebody was calling him on a Saturday, it had to be an emergency.
Sure.
Chad,
that's very noble. That's very noble of him.
Chad, may I ask, are you using a speakerphone?